Now let me have a brief introduction to the life of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts, to a prominent and prosperous family. Along with her younger sister, Lavinia, and older brother, Austin, Dickinson experienced a quiet and reserved family life headed by her authoritarian father, Edward Dickinson. Although Dickinson didn't present 19th century politics, economics, and social issues in the foreground of her poetry, she lived in a family environment which was immersed in them. Her grandfather was one of the founders of Amherst College. Edward Dickinson, her father, a lawyer, the treasurer of the Amherst College, an active town official, served in the General Court of Massachusetts, the State Senate, and the United States House of Representatives. Emily Dickinson's mother, Emily Norcross Dickinson, was not a powerful presence in her life. Both parents intended to raise her to be a cultured Christian woman responsible for a family of her own. But Dickinson was so individualistic that she didn't fall into step with the conventional piety, domesticity, and social duty. This is Dickinson homestead. The evergreen is Austin's house. Both houses were facing the main street. And this is a picture I took in 2002 of Emily Dickinson's house on Main Street, Amherst, Massachusetts. And these two pictures are of Dickinson's bedroom. We see the tiny desk on which Dickinson wrote almost 2,000 tiny poems. Given this background, which included an education more extensive than usual for young women of that period, 2 years at Amherst Academy and 1 year at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, we can assume that the intellectual and social life of the Amherst College community was available to Emily Dickinson. As a schoolgirl, Emily Dickinson was a young woman who was shy but fun-loving, not beautiful, but somewhat striking and very neat in dress. Dickinson began to lead a rather solitary life since 1853, when he was 23 years old. A letter of that year says, "I do not go from home." The fact remains that from age 30 on, her life was essentially withdrawn from society. Her solitude doesn't seem to have taken a morbid turn, anything unhealthy psychologically, until the death of her father in 1874. Actually, apart from an excursion to Philadelphia and Washington, and several trips to Boston to see a doctor about an eye disorder called exotropia, Dickinson lived all her life in her father's house. Her adult life was as short on external incident, but it was as long on imagination. Dickinson rarely received visitors, and in her mature years, she never went out. She dressed only in white and became known as the Myth of Amherst. As I have mentioned, only a dozen of her poems were published during her lifetime, and enormously. Unlike Walt Whitman, who became the public bar of his age, Emily Dickinson chose to live internally within the confines of her home, yet with a limitless expansion of imagination, a choice she was well aware of in her poem, "I Dwell in Possibility," in which she says, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors. Possibility is a conceit here, a far-fetched comparison, comparing possibility of her imagination to her house, which is more beautiful than prose. And prose, distinguished from verse, writes about the facts of the limited here and now. So the house of possibility is superior to the house of fact. It has more outlets onto the world, more windows, and more doors. And this poem is a good example of Emily Dickinson's power of compression, her ability to give the most possible meaning in the fewest possible words. The reader must supply a good part of the sentence, but the meaning is never really obscured. So in this poem, Emily Dickinson is speaking about the possibilities of imagination and the limitations of reason. She chooses to live internally in a house of poetry of imagination rather than in a house of prose of the here and now. Her solitary life does not restrict her creative sensibilities. She wrote nearly 1,800 poems altogether, and her collective works, plus a lot of correspondence, are filled with intense feelings, from terror to joy. She just simplified life, so that doing without was a means of being within. It seemed as if she was attempting to redefine the meaning of deprivation, because being denied something provided a sharper, more intense focus on the true meaning of life. Water is taught by thirst, and success is counted sweeter by those who never succeed. Dickinson's poems also reveal her intimate knowledge of the Bible, classical myth, and works of Shakespeare. In addition, she admired the work of transcendentalists, Thoreau and Emerson, and read the Brontes, the Brownings, Keats, and George Eliot. Biblical ideas, subjects, allusions, and imagery abound in her work, and biblical quotations in her letters and poems exceed references to any other source or author. In her letter to Dickinson, she even wrote, "While Shakespeare remains, literature is firm." In a poem she wrote, Hamlet to himself was Hamlet, had not Shakespeare wrote.